Thank you so much for joining us. We are doing something new and exciting with this season of No Longer Silent. This time, we are going to insert voices of other national leaders to help expand the conversation. We hope you enjoy this new feature and let us know what you think in the comments.
Damage from the deep cuts to Medicaid in President Trump's spending bill could extend far beyond rural hospitals.
This is just one in a series of many cuts we're seeing across health agencies across the country.
Billions of dollars are on hold nationwide.
A local nonprofit organization says recent cuts under President Trump's new spending bill will force them to cancel one of their programs.
Federal officials are cutting more than $11 billion from health organizations across the nation.
No Longer Silent. Advocacy Leaders Unmuted. Hello and welcome to season 2 of our No Longer Silent podcast. This is an advocacy leader learning series that we will get to hear from the nation's top leaders who are making a difference and fighting and advocating on behalf of each of you. Today, we welcome Mr. Jovan Agee, businessman, advocacy leader, and friend. In our episode, The System Listens When We Organize. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me for a bit today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I've learned so much from you over the years about advocacy and policy and how to show up in this space that we could not have this conversation without having your voice included in the discussion. So we are so happy to have you here. So why don't you tell us, first of all, how you first got involved with policy?
Wow. I sort of start the story probably around my last year of college. And I got an internship with a labor union in Sacramento, California, a international labor union. And I was fortunate to work in their political and legislative department for my internship. And I worked for their lead lobbyist for the state of California. Mm-hmm. And so it was in that internship where I became formally acclimated, formally introduced to the policymaking process at the state level. And so then from there, got introduced to kind of the local policy decision-making process and then the federal level. And when I talk about policy, I'm kind of speaking specifically about legislation because, there's different types of policies, but I'm speaking specifically about legislation that then becomes, bills and then ultimately becomes laws.
So not to minimize your college experience as an intern, would you say that it's something that you kind of happened upon and then it took root and from there it's grown to where you are today?
Absolutely. I was interested in the internship because it was paid. I was a political science. I was a government major. And so was interested in potentially going to law school and then becoming a sports agent. I took the paid internship and really kind of just fell in love with one, who my, supervisor, my manager was, an individual by the name of Willie Pelote, who was a long time kind of staple in the political arena in the state and nationally. And so, really fell in love with him, his outlook, his energy. I really just fell in love with the work. And so I've always seen myself as someone, who likes to solve puzzles. I like to really delve into very complex things that are abstract and make them less abstract, make them tangible, make them material. And so I saw similarities between being a sports agent and then ultimately, I became a professionally trained lobbyist. That was my kind of first training in this space. And so I saw a lot of similarities between the representation. But, in my opinion, I kind of justified it and ultimately ended up veering into the political arena because, I saw a lot of the constituents that I was working directly with were workers, low income workers, many of which were called working poor. And so I just, really felt the need for those group of individuals to need representation, whereas, professional athletes, they can pay for good representation. Unfortunately, sometimes they still don't get it.
Right.
But I just, my heart was really drawn to using the gifts God has given me to help people that, normally wouldn't have the quality of representation that I knew I could bring.
What would you say has been your most impactful campaign that you've been involved in to date?
Yeah, so I would say the campaign that I'm most proud of, and it's really kind of where I built my name and my reputation in the space. It was actually my very first piece of legislation. And anyone who knows me knows that I like to take on the hard stuff. I have a reputation of where most people are running from the burning building, I'm running towards it kind of thing. And so my very first piece of legislation was a bill that provided domestic workers direct deposit in the state of California. This was around 2004. Domestic workers didn't have direct deposit. They didn't have access to direct deposit. So they received their pay, paper check. And for those, of us that kind of remember when that was the only option, those things can get lost or stolen, particularly talking about a workforce that many of them lived where they worked. Right. And so, at the time you're talking about people who are making minimum wage, some maybe making $8 an hour. then you run the risk of losing, your paycheck. Or if you do get your paycheck, many of them are unbanked. So then, you go take your check to the check cashing place and they take a large percentage. So I had asked an organization who had unsuccessfully tried to advance the issue for 5 years, could I take on the issue? That's kind of protocol. You just don't take on an issue. It's kind of, you're stepping in someone else's arena. So I asked them, could I? And they sort of jokingly said, good luck. I think Governor Schwarzenegger was the governor at the time. Good luck. He's already told us that he's not going to sign anything in this realm. And so I took on the challenge. I created 2 lines of thinking. I created one that was geared towards Republicans. And I dove into the cost or cost savings, I should say, of doing direct deposit over paper checks. It's like 66 cents on the dollar cheaper to do a direct deposit. And so that really appealed to Republicans. Right. And then for the Democrats, I created a strategy and a narrative that appealed to their heartstrings, right? And so at the time, state workers who, made 4 times as much as domestic workers had free direct deposit for like 27 years up until that point. Mm-hmm. So at that point, it became an issue of parity and equity. How, we're giving people who make $30,000 to $40,000, $50,000 a year free direct deposit, but we're not, extending that to domestic workers. And so, long story short, ended up introducing the bill, got 76 co-authors on the bill. So 76 out of 120 members of the California State Legislature came on board, a ton of Republicans, ton of Democrats. The bill ultimately got signed that year. And so that's still to this day, almost 20 years later for me is still one of the highlights, because to me, that issue is why I'm in this space. And the fight is, it showed the world kind of who I am in terms of, not afraid to take on things that most people think are impossible.
Wow, that is so good, so good. And it connects me to even the work that we do, right? If you look at your history and you're just putting little markers on the map right now, right? That doesn't even begin to touch the depth and breadth of your body of work over the course of your 20 plus year career. But, it is intriguing to just hear how you get from, sports agent to lobbyist to, I love the phrase, running toward the burning building and ending up at the burning building, to go deep into the community and literally put boots on the ground and to humanize the experiences of people that were considered the least of these, but yet suffering the most, and to spearhead and successfully execute a piece of legislation that could make access to our resources more equitable. And then I take a sharp turn and say, and then how do you get over to being a key advisor to a breast cancer organization?
Yeah, so for me, it's simple. Where are there voids in our common sense? And what I mean by that, when I say the we, I'm talking about, governance, government. The whole point of government is to take care of the least of these. Wealthy people don't really need government. They can pay for most things. They can pay for their own childcare, healthcare. I mean, so when you think about, why government was created, it was really created to take care of those who don't necessarily have the resources or the wherewithal that they need for assistance. And so I think somewhere maybe we've gotten away from that. And in large part, it's, I think, because of all the dollars really needed to run for office nowadays. And so for me, when you look at a Carrie's Touch and, my why in terms of how I got involved in this is, number one, I don't do a lot of work with nonprofits. So I'm just going to put that on the record because it's hard work. Yeah. And most of them, I would argue, don't really have vision and are methodical in terms of planning. And so then what ends up happening is it becomes this vicious cycle of program dollars. And it's not really compounding to the point to where they can become independent, get off that hamster wheel, right? And so for me, getting to learn more about Carrie's Touch, learning more about what it does, it really took me back to the beginning of my career. I started in health policy, right? So when you talk about domestic workers, you talk about domestic workers work in what is known as the In-Home Support Services program in California. Anyone who knows about the In-Home Support Services program in California, it has the smallest caseload within the Health and Human Services budget, but is the most costly in the Health and Human Services budget, because we're talking about people that, although the caseload is small, they have very severe health needs. So they're costly to the system. And so, I spent about the first 10 years of my career working in health and human services policy. Then from there, began to work in education, transportation, public safety. And then mostly in what I deal with now is housing and economic development. And so, when the Carrie's Touch, the organization was brought to my attention, the issue was brought to my attention, it was something that was very natural for me. There was a language that I understood. There was a culture that I understood. There was a need that I understood. And then when you layer on top of it, I think gender and race, right? Which is, I think, what Carrie's Touch brings. So it's very hyper woman, even though we know men get breast cancer, right? So again, it kind of took me right back to my start. Domestic workers are the same thing, right? 85% of, domestic workers are women. Most of them are, early 50s. Most of them are Latinas. A lot of people don't know these statistics. So for me, it kind of took me really kind of just right back to the start of my career, but in a different place now where I feel like, instead of me being able to leverage the organization at the time that I was with to help domestic workers, now it's sort of like, me coming in and try to leverage relationships, intellectual capital, and then just really kind of fanning the flame of what's already been built. I mean, I think Carrie's Touch is one of the best kept secrets, I think, in the state. And I think that it's just going to take more visibility and financial resources. Some things are timing. We understand that there are political wins. And right now, health policy is just really not popular. From, a lot of people are focused on housing, and some of your traditional issues like education and housing just aren't necessarily as popular right now for whatever reason. But I think that when they do become, I think, front of mind again, I think that Carrie's Touch is very well positioned to hopefully create some legislative leaders at the state level, because there aren't a lot that will take on this issue and really right wrongs. And so my job is to really begin to help cultivate that.
Right.
I think legislative leadership, and to make sure that Carrie's Touch is speaking about itself in a way that, only politicos can understand.
We want to pause for a moment to thank our platinum partner, Amgen. Amgen has been a consistent partner who not just talks the talk, they fight hard to illuminate voices and experiences of diverse patients. We're truly thankful for such a beautiful partnership. So why is it so important for community-based organizations to understand policy and political strategies?
First and foremost, if you're watching this or if you live in the United States, we have to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, that our economy is capitalistic. And capitalistic economy means that it's really survival of the fittest. When you talk about now adding on to this idea of capitalism, you now wrap around it this thing called government, which was created to decide who gets what, when, and where. Government then creates things that we call policy to do that. The politics comes into who shapes the policy. And then it also comes into who benefits or doesn't benefit from the policy. Whether it's a healthcare issue that Carrie's Touch may be dealing with, or brick and mortar issues like what physical location can Carrie's Touch operate in, right? All of that is decided by government in some way, even if it's private sector. People realize, the private sector is impacted by government. I mean, government is a huge, sometimes visible or less visible influence in all of these things.
You just talked about the economy. You talked about the U.S. being a capitalist union and how the haves have more and how the have-nots have less. And we look at what has taken place in this country since January 19 of 2025. Can you share your perspective on what's happening now and give us some tips or best practices on how to move forward?
My assessment on what's happening right now is that for too long, low income and working class communities gave people passes. I mean, specifically leaders, whether those leaders were faith leaders, whether those leaders were elected leaders in particular. When you live in a capitalistic society, production is really primarily what matters. And the more that you allow for non-production, it's at your own demise. And so I think there have been, too many instances over the past few decades where people have been given passes because maybe they share the same race group as someone else. And so because that person may be the same race as me, I don't hold them as accountable as I would someone else. Or if someone is of the same political or partisan ideology as me, I don't hold them as accountable as I would someone else. And I think those decades of passes have led to death by 1,000 cuts. And so when we look at things like the wealth gap today in many ways is much worse than it was 100 years ago. But then you have to beg the question and say, well, how is that when we have more quote unquote marginalized or quote unquote minorities, whatever you want to call yourself, in elected office? Shouldn't things be better? Not if they don't produce. It's not. And producing is not getting the seat. Producing is what are you doing for your constituency when you get the seat? I think there needs to be some studiedness. The Bible says study to show thyself approved. And so I think no longer can we just register to vote and go vote without being studied. I think we need to assess all things, and really see if people are qualified on the thing that we care about. There's a lot of people that run on issues and they make us care about them, but they may not be our bread and butter issue. I don't know if, I care about someone's sexual orientation if, you're threatening to tax businesses to death and then the major corporation leaves Detroit and we don't get another major corporation to come back for 50 years. Right. And we're celebrating it because we were tough on Ford. I mean, it's just ignorance that these electeds and other leaders are selling communities that really hurt themselves. And so I just think it's going to take average people to stand up and have courage and demand more from their leadership in terms of, if we're going to change. I think it's going to really come down to average people being honest with themselves. And then really, I think doing two things. I think making sure that they get their fair share from government. But then I think concurrent to that, doing everything in their power to making sure that they're building their own personal economies, their household economies, and then their community economy so that they can ultimately become less and less dependent on government.
Let's bring another voice into this conversation.
we really need to think about getting out of the traditional molds of our input and how our voice is being heard. We often see that grants, they're going to trusted organizations who may give our African American nonprofit organizations a few crumbs to be able to say, oh, we have, this group working with us or whatever. We just need to start taking back our power. And getting our message out there and being proactive. We can't be complacent. That time is over, and we need to look to our ancestors and what they had to do and use that as a model for moving forward.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Be sure to come back and check out Sandra's full episode. A thing that I love about being in conversation with you is that oftentimes you are very black and white. It's this or it's that. And the other times I bring in the gray because while I agree with much of what you've shared, I would push back and say, do you think that everybody is there with where you're talking about us having to do our due diligence and to be learned on various issues, because there are many of us out there that are doing the things that you're saying, and yet we still find ourselves here. I question, where are we in a place that there are some of us that need to know more? There are some of us, it's not about courage, it's that I'm trying to keep my lights on. It's some of us are trying to keep food on the table. Some of us are, raising children with or without a partner. And there are life's issues that we are dealing with and navigating on our own that might prevent us from fully being able to move in political space the way you are suggesting. What do you say to that?
I would say a couple things. One, I don't think it's good for us to be on our own. No one survives if they aren't a part of a community. And so I think we have to get back, no matter who the we are, whatever the stakeholder group, I'll identify as a stakeholder group, whatever your issue is, you got to find your we. Mm-hmm. It's why unions have existed for the last 100 years and are still very powerful in the political space, even though union density has declined. Mm-hmm. But they still throw their weight around as if they're still representing the numbers they did in the 1950s and 60s. Mm. And it's because they are organized, which means that they're pooling all of their capital, their intellectual capital, their financial capital, their organizational infrastructure. And so I think we kind of have to get back to some of that. It's not always this grandioso stuff. It's, do you know the 10 houses around you kind of stuff. Just as there's layers of government, right? We have a federal government for a reason. We have a state government for a reason. Then we have city councils and school boards, right? I think we have to sort of look at kind of community the same way. And because without it, we won't be able to make it. I mean, not to mention just all the social benefits from not being isolated, right? I'm just speaking right now to the economic and power benefits of being together. And unfortunately, I don't see that in a very sustained way. I see it happen in glimpses, reactionary. Right. Something happened that caused us to coalesce. George Floyd, or, a president gets in office and then, the president is actually doing what he said he's going to do. But when he was just saying it, no one really did anything. But now that he's doing it, people say, oh, my gosh. Right. So we have to get out of it being a reactionary thing. And I think just understand that, again, in a capitalistic society where survival of the fittest, the more fit that you are, the reality of it is probably the less community dependent you have to be. But even the more fit still depend on community, because if nothing else, that's their customer base.
Yeah.
So they still have community.
Absolutely. Wow. So many good nuggets. So many good nuggets. You've got two beautiful young girls who are growing up in this society. What is your advice to them? Because, Carrie's Touch, at minimum, we do these conversations. We have these conversations so that we can educate our base, talking about what you're talking about. People, you got to do better. But in order to do better, you got to know better. And if you don't know where to get the knowledge, or there's a whole bunch of voices on social media today. And so who's a trusted voice? And Carrie's Touch is definitely a trusted voice in the community. So if you had to give your two daughters space on how to engage in policy and advocacy as they continue to grow, what would it be?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, my advice to them and any young person and any person is to know the word of God. I mean, that's what has kept me. That's what has sustained me. And so my advice to my daughters is, and will always be, if they ever forget, is to keep the word of God close to their heart. Not even my words, because sometimes, to your point, I may not even get from what's in my brain out of my mouth aligned the right way. Which is, our back and forth always. And then you parse it out and then I say, yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was meaning, kind of thing. So, but, the word of God reigns true. and it speaks to us the way that it needs to, because although my daughters are an extension of me, they are not me and I'm not them. So my experience aren't necessarily transferable. So it's important that they have their own relationship with God. They have their own relationship with the Word of God. And then from there, just do your homework. There's so many people in the space that jump on issues because we live in an era of social media, and they jump on issues because they're popular and they may be sexy, and that's where the money is. My advice to them was, don't get caught up in that kind of stuff. Don't get caught up in fads. Find out what it is that you really believe in. Find out what it is that you really care about. And if it's not popular, make it popular. If you see something that you think society is missing, which is often the case, because sometimes we don't get to root issues. Sometimes we're dealing with the outgrowths of root issues. And so most people, I would say, in the political space, they don't really see the root issue. And that's what's got me so attracted to the housing thing, because as you said, like, we can fix the health system tomorrow. We give it all the money that it needs. But if there aren't some fundamental things there, like, people can't read, right? I can't read my prescription, right? Or if I have a language barrier, or if I don't have a home, all those things become impediments to even the best healthcare system on the planet.
Where are the opportunities for Carrie's Touch to advance our own political agenda within the state and or federal landscape?
Yeah, I think right now presents a unique opportunity because a completely different policy area has already kind of lended itself to the framework and to the narrative that could be leveraged. So right now, nationally, within the state of California, there's a lot of conversations about the necessary resources and capacity to build our housing and economic development infrastructure. The state of California has done a lot to try to position itself to be prepared from some of the dollars that could flow from the federal government. And so I think that that same thinking and that same conversation, unfortunately, is not happening in the health space. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for people in the health space, particularly organizations like Carrie's Touch, to be having a conversation that when we talk about the built environment, people are part of that as well. Because, it's more than just roads and pipes and, windows and all that kind of stuff. If there's no people to go to these jobs, then you still haven't done anything. So I think there's a huge voice and commentary missing in the conversation that is naturally connected to what you talk about anyway, but it's not talked about in that way because it's not housing and economic development. And as you know, every space has its own language. So it will be not common for people in the health space to speak that way. Developers speak that way. Builders speak that way. But that's exactly what people in the health space are doing. They're building immune systems. They're building sustenance. They're building the body so that it can, be vital and thrive so that we have a healthy society. And so it's the exact same concept. We're just not talking about building commercial buildings and residential buildings. We're talking about people. And so I just think there's a very interesting opportunity to take that line of logic and start to really press those same people who are so adamant about being, quote unquote, what you would call in healthcare preventative, right? So we talk about the stuff they're talking about. They're talking about, right, how do we get ahead of the problem? Well, that's kind of a health concept. So I just think there's a very interesting opportunity to maybe build, some non-traditional allies in some other spaces and maybe tap into some dollars that otherwise wouldn't be available if you're just kind of looking at your traditional players, your traditional spaces, and your traditional sources. So I think those are some immediate opportunities that could be explored is, what does some of our human infrastructure look like? How are we building that? And then how do we position ourselves to be prepared? Because if not, we're going to build all this stuff and there's going to be no one in to occupy them anyway.
Thank you. I literally just said that this morning on a call about research and diversifying research and getting people signed up to participate in clinical trials and all of these things. And I said, I participated in a clinical trial, so I understand the importance of research. I believe that the trial that I was in saved my life. My doctor said I'd be dead in less than 5 years, and I'm 20 years a survivor. And I said, but we don't think about the people. We don't humanize the data. We always talk about the numbers, but there's a pulse attached to each number that we have gathered in the research. And so I think with what you're saying and that very same concept of a conversation where people talk around the humans who are the ones here occupying space, I think that we definitely are in position to be that voice in the community. My final question around this topic is, are you going to help us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope I have been of help thus far. But I plan to continue to be of help. And even with the conversation, that you're kind of just alluding to, even in how we're talking about the dollars needs to change. Because again, we have to understand that we're talking about it in the context of a capitalistic society. So, the reason why you're seeing over the past decade these huge shifts to dialysis clinics, it's not because people all of a sudden care about people of color and their diabetes.
No, it's money.
It's because these things are major money makers, right? I always joke, say they're the new liquor stores in our communities, right?
Yes.
So I think it's figuring out how to talk about these issues, not solely in a humane way, because unfortunately, I think politicians kind of have become numb. They get 10, 15 minutes a day about what's the heartstring thing to do. But I think when you talk about it from a profit standpoint, and profit simply means what's the benefit, what's the gain. Right. And so I think when you look at the savings, I would maybe redirect that and say that's a profit, that's a gain, right? So when you look at why should we go prevention versus reaction, one is cheaper, it's faster, quicker, right? All these things. And so I also think it's maybe shifting how we talk about it, maybe not always, but to a particular audience, to package it in a way that says, hey, if this was a for-profit business, if Carrie's Touch or any organization involved in doing or wanting to get more involved in the preventative side of these health conditions, if this was a business model, if you invest in us, if you're a seed investor, this is what our ROI is. Our ROI is that we can save you X amount of dollars. And there are many businesses that's their sole job. That's my 2 cents on, kind of where I see opportunities in the current political and legislative marketplace, and, definitely plan to continue to be of help as long as you desire me to do so.
My next question is an easy one, I hope. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that the people hear?
Absolutely. One of them is my book. It's called The Lobby Guide, Your Roadmap to Influence. And I wrote the book because there are so many people that will never meet an individual with the professional training that I have. Or if they do, they will never have the resources needed to have that individual or that business provide them services. And so my book was a way to decentralize information. I look at myself as a disruptor in my space. There are too many people that have all this, insider knowledge locked up somewhere. And so this book is something that I feel like people should read. It's a continual read, no matter what it is you're trying to do to influence something, to make your issue known. It's a roadmap, literally what it's called. And so that's one. And then the other is, I just think that we really have to get connected. So I would say that people that are interested in breast cancer, Black women breast cancer in particular, we got to stop reinventing the wheel. And I think people have to learn to start plugging into things. And that's part of the value of community, is that, we aren't isolated people sitting on fiefdoms or islands, but we become to kind of intersect and we work together. The other, and this is really a challenge, I think, to other guests who you may have on, is I think that for people like me and you who have been blessed to do what we do at a high level, I think we have to create, real estate in our calendars. And I think we have to create real estate in our budgets to give that back to people and organizations, irrespective of their financial wherewithal or their ability to pay. And so I always make sure that I, leave some space in my docket, in my book of business where I can help organizations that, can't pay market, because I feel like, I've been extremely blessed. The only people who benefit shouldn't be people that can pay, the kind of fees that you have to pay in this space to get quality service.
Wow, and wow again. And I want to be the first to thank you for your generosity toward Carrie's Touch and your support of the work that we're doing, especially with Dinner with the Youngers. It is our show that I wrote as a response to the legendary play A Raisin in the Sun that is dealing with housing injustice and many of the issues that we have discussed here today, all the way back, to the 1950s. And so here we are still 60 plus years later, still dealing with those same issues. And so I'd love an opportunity that maybe we do a study with your book and we get some folks on, we talk about your book, the chapters, because we're talking about where do we start? And it sounds like your book could be a roadmap to, at minimum, give people a starting place and at best give them the knowledge to equip and empower them to go out and to use their voices to affect change. Thank you so very much. So we talk about a lot of things and they're pretty heavy. And as we're winding down, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I just want the answer that comes off the top of your head. I know you're a deep thinker. I know you're intentional, but whatever comes off the top of your head. Name a food that you'd fight somebody over.
Gumbo.
All right. What song is guaranteed to get you out of your seat?
Most any song from Frankie Beverly.
What's your go-to guilty pleasure TV show or movie when you need a break from the world?
Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the original version from the late 70s.
Now, we've got to talk about that.
That's my favorite movie of all time.
You just don't know people when you think you know them. What's something small that brings you big joy?
The sun on a clear day when it's warm.
Well, that's our time. Thank you so very much for joining us and blessing us with your wisdom and your knowledge. We look forward to having you again, and we look forward to launching this podcast to help the people.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and blessings to you and everything you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to No Longer Silent Season 2, Advocacy Leaders Unmuted. Special thank you to our platinum sponsor, Amgen. Thank you for being such a long-time partner and friend in this advocacy space. And none of this would be made possible without our dynamic tribe here at Carrie's Touch. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Angelica. We will see you next time on the next episode of No Longer Silent.